As we dive in this morning, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 3. And as we come to this text, I have a question for you. How many of you like to wait? Probably not very many. Yesterday, or I guess it was 2 days ago, I don't even remember. Melissa and I had a doctor's appointment in Springfield for Griff. We were taking him, and the appointment was at about 10:30. We were pulling out of town about 9:15, and we thought, hey, we've got enough time to run to Sonic, grab something to drink before we hit the road. And so we were leaving, and Melissa wanted to order it ahead of time on the Sonic app while we were driving there. I said, no, babe, the drive-thru is going to be no big deal. We can just hit the drive-thru, go through, and we'll be on our way. Well, we get to the drive-thru, and guess what? Oh, man, the drive-thru was full. And at that point, it's too late. You can't order it on the app, so we just have to bear it. And I think, okay, no problem. They're going to get us through really fast. Well, guess what? That did not happen, and we've got a doctor's appointment to get to, so we go through. We don't get on the road till at the worst, or at the best, 9:35, and the whole time Melissa is just like, Tim, this was your fault. You took us through the drive-thru, and I was like, it was my fault. It was totally my fault. But in those moments, we don't like to wait, do we? And that's kind of a silly example, but just generally in life, I have never met a person who said, I am the kind of person who just loves to wait. And yet, here's the reality in our Christian walk is that oftentimes we find ourselves in a period of waiting. As we jump into the book of Ruth today, we're going to be following the track of three different characters that we know well at this point. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, who in chapter 3, we see that they've been doing a lot of waiting, but this is the moment now when things are about to change. And I want you to think for a moment about Naomi. You know Naomi. Naomi was the one who lost her husband Elimelech. She lost her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. She is brokenhearted to the point of even saying, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Naomi is a broken-hearted woman who has lost almost all of her faith, and she's there in that period of waiting and wondering, does God even see me? Then you have Ruth, and at this point in the story, Ruth has come on the scene. She has said, Naomi, I will be faithful to you to the very end. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I will go to you. Where you die, I will die. And she has been faithful. But even now, she's in a period of waiting, that consistent obedience, but still not knowing what the future holds, not knowing what God has for her. She's waiting, but she's faithful. And then you have Boaz, who his whole life, it seems, has been this kind of a rock of a man. He's faithful in a time when other men are not, this time when men do what is right in their own eyes. Boaz follows the living God, and Boaz, who's an older man, is kind of about to go into the sunset of his days and kind of just waiting for the Lord to take him home. But all three of them are in a season of waiting. And here's the amazing thing about waiting, is that waiting for Naomi meant years, even decades. Waiting for Ruth meant waiting to see after months of working in the field. She didn't know the timetable. She didn't know what was happening. Waiting for Boaz meant not knowing at all what God had in store for him. But when it comes to all of it, here's what I love, is that for some it's decades, for some it's months, for some it's years, but for everyone, it's all about to change in the moment, in the blink of an eye, in this 24-hour period that we're about to read about. Up to this point, we've had years in the book of Ruth. Now we're going to focus in the next chapter and in this chapter on a 24-hour period that is literally going to change the course of history. And this is kind of how it works, isn't it? I mean, I listened to a podcast about World War II, and kind of it's a history podcast that happens to be on World War II right now. And this last week, I heard about the Battle of Midway. And some of you know about this. It was during World War II in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese had this incredible upper hand. They surprised the United States at Pearl Harbor. The battle raged in the Pacific, and the Japanese racked up victory after victory after victory. But it was at the Battle of Midway that things began to change quickly. And here's what historians will say. There's kind of a debate as to whether it happened in 5 minutes or whether it was more like 30 or maybe 45 minutes. But in the course of this small period of time, perhaps as little as 5 minutes, the course of the entire war changed when the United States was able to sink 3 aircraft carriers of the Japanese. And at that point, the tide of the war shifted and changed. And here's what I've found in my own life, and here's what I think is probably true of you as well, is that oftentimes what happens in life is that you go through a season of consistency, you go through a season of equilibrium, but sometimes it's a matter of minutes where the course of everything changes. Maybe for you it was a phone call. Someone had passed away. life changed. Or maybe it was a job opportunity. Maybe it was a positive thing you weren't looking for. Something came up. Or maybe a house came up for sale and you were able to get that house and move to a new area. But here's the thing. Oftentimes what happens is there's an equilibrium. There's a consistency. There's a season. And then all of the sudden, that period of waiting is over. And that's exactly what we're going to see as we jump into the text. These three different people, all in different moments, all in different spaces, they're all waiting. But in the providence of God, He weaves it together so that this incredibly short period of time, God does a work that is still reverberating. And that's what I want us to jump into and read this morning as we jump into Ruth chapter 3. We're going to start there in verse 1. And here's what it says, that Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of?" Now pause right here and just remember where we're at. Again, Ruth has been working in the field of Boaz. Boaz has shown favor to both Ruth and Naomi. Remember that Ruth and Naomi are destitute. They have no one to protect them. They have no one to provide for them. But Boaz looks with favor on them and says, "I will provide for you." Now, in the text, it doesn't give us an exact timeline, but it says it's during the harvest season. So that was likely a couple of months ago whenever Boaz had said this to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth has continued to work in the field of Boaz, but Naomi says to her, essentially, "Ruth, we're taken care of for the moment, but isn't it on me, isn't it my obligation and duty to find rest for you so that you will be taken care of, not just for this moment, but permanently?" And so Naomi says to Ruth, "Now isn't Boaz our relative?" In other words, Boaz has been a nice guy to this point, but Naomi says maybe Boaz would step up to the plate and be willing to be something more. Maybe he would be our redeemer. After all, he's our relative. And she says, "Haven't you been working with his female servants?" And then she says this evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Now pause right here, because Boaz is a relative and Naomi knows. And think about this from Naomi's perspective for a moment. We don't know how long Naomi has been kind of thinking about this or brooding on this, but we know that she loves Ruth. She calls her again here, "my daughter." We know that she loves Ruth. We know that she wants Ruth to be taken care of. So we don't know how long Naomi has been thinking about this, but she is compelled at this moment to say, "Ruth, now is the time to act." And, it's interesting as we keep going. Many of you know the show, The Beverly Hillbillies. That's kind of an old classic, right? And I love The Beverly Hillbillies because of a lot of things. It's just a hilarious show. There's just a lot of good humor in it. But I love Granny. You remember Granny on The Beverly Hillbillies? Granny was the one, she had that kind of, skull and bones toxin that she would go around and drink. It would kind of solve all of her problems. But she was kind of this cantankerous old lady, but she was also one who kind of pulled the strings. And I remember one episode, she was talking to Jed Clampett, the kind of hero and the kind of main character of the story. She's talking to Jed, and Jed is saying, "Granny, I remember when I married your daughter, I remember my plan. I was going to propose to her here right under this tree. I knew exactly when I wanted to do it. I knew exactly where I wanted to do it." And Granny looks at him and says, "Well, Jed, don't you know that I set all of that up?" And he says, "Absolutely not, Granny. You didn't have anything to do with that." And she said, "Jed, who do you think planted that tree?" And this whole time, Granny is saying, you think that this was just happened to be and it was your plan, but in reality, I was working behind the scenes. And that's kind of how I see Naomi in this picture. Like Naomi is there, they've been provided for, and it's almost like once she begins to see that provision, she's starting to think, "Man, what can I do for Ruth? What can I do for Ruth?" And she comes up with this plan. And I want us to read the plan, starting there in verse 3. They know where Boaz is going to be. He's going to be on the threshing floor. And at this point, Naomi comes in, and she says this, "Ruth, wash, put on perfumed oil, wear your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking." Now pause again right there. See this for what it is. This is Naomi trying to set up Ruth and Boaz. Now, I said in the beginning, one of my pet peeves is seeing this as kind of a romance novel where Boaz is this sort of bronzed, handsome man who's kind of just waiting for the right woman to come along, and that Ruth is this kind of Hollywood starlet, and she's just in the perfect place, and God crossed their stars, and now they fall in love. No, that's not what's going on, but in this moment, see that Naomi is on a mission, and she tells Ruth, "Ruth, when Boaz sees you, he doesn't need to see the servant in the field anymore. He needs to see the woman who's washed, who smells good, who's ready and waiting," because Naomi says, "Ruth, I'm going to send you to go propose to Boaz." We're going to talk about that in a moment. But I can't help but smile as Naomi says, wash, put on your perfumed oil, put on your best clothes. And then she says, I mean, this is not just, okay, go try. This is a plan. Look at how she says it. Verse 4, when he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. And then he will explain to you what you should do. So the trap is set, right? Naomi says, Ruth, this is where Boaz is going to be. This is when he's going to be there. Go get your best clothes. Go get ready. And go get ready to catch Boaz's eye. So Ruth said to her, verse 5, Ruth said to her, I will do everything you say. Don't you love Ruth? I mean, Ruth is just the kind of person that says, Naomi, I may not know what all this means. I may not know what all this entails, but if you tell me to do it, by golly, I am going to do it. And so Ruth says, I'll do everything. It says in verse 6, she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. And then look at this, in verse 7, after Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley, and she came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Now, I want us to pause for a moment because there's a whole lot going on in this text we need to unpack. In fact, some scholars look at this text, and they say that what Naomi told Ruth to do was to actually go and seduce Boaz in the same way that a woman of the night would go to seduce a man. And this is why some scholars say that, because the threshing floor was kind of the place where these things were known to happen. It would have been the kind of thing where everybody knows this is what happens at the threshing floor. And when you tell someone to go get dressed up, when you tell someone to go uncover someone's feet, it wasn't perhaps just the feet that Naomi was telling Ruth to go uncover. In other words, this was something that many people would have looked at this and kind of, wait a minute, what's going on? What is Naomi telling Ruth to do? And as Ruth obeys, as Ruth complies, she goes. And think about the peril that Ruth would have faced. We've talked about this before. Remember, Ruth is a Moabite. And we don't know about those Moabites. We don't know especially about those Moabite women and what they come to town to do. And so what would the cost have been if Ruth the Moabite would have been caught going, uncovering the feet of this man, looking good, looking dressed up, looking desirable at the place where everybody knows these things happen? This was a gamble. And as we look at this text, of course, we don't necessarily read it with our heart beating, but our heart should be pounding. What happens if someone discovers that Ruth has gone to the threshing floor? What happens if Boaz takes this the wrong way and sees this as Ruth kind of coming to seduce him? What happens to Ruth? What happens to Naomi? This is a huge gamble. This is a huge moment where Ruth does what she's told to do, but what is going to happen? Let's keep reading. At midnight, Boaz was startled, turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. And this is a shocker moment. And by the way, the debate is, what was Ruth going to uncover? Most people think it's this, that Ruth was literally uncovering his feet, that it wasn't something unscrupulous in other ways. She was uncovering his feet so that literally at night, as it got cooler, his feet would get cold. And eventually, if you've ever had this happen to you, you've woken up in the night, your feet get cold, you try and cover yourself up, and you go back to sleep. But it startled Boaz because when he woke up, oh, wow, I'm so cold, I don't remember, not covering myself. Now he looks at his feet, and behold, he sees a woman. Now, this is kind of how this plays in my mind. You can use your sanctified imagination to imagine it yourself. I kind of imagine that there's kind of like maybe a fire that's kind of the embers are there and there's a soft glow. And here's why I say that, because when Boaz looks at her, he's able to see her, right? He's able to distinguish, this is a woman that I see. So there's got to be some level of light. He looks up, he sees that it's a woman. It's the middle of the night. He doesn't know who she is. He doesn't know why she's there. He doesn't know what she's proposing. But he looks at this woman and he says to her, who are you? At which point, Ruth, who is at the edge of the plank, says, I am going to jump and not look back. She says to him, I am Ruth, your servant, she replied. And then she says this, take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer. This is Ruth proposing marriage to Boaz. Which, when we think about our culture, it's very interesting. There's a kind of a taboo, and I'm kind of a traditionally minded guy, right? I mean, I went to ask Melissa's parents before I asked her to marry me. That was a fun conversation and a good conversation, and then eventually I kind of thought, as a man, I want to be the one to propose. Melissa, please come take my hand in marriage. But I'm starting to see the other side of that coin with daughters. My oldest daughter, Adelaide, she got her hair fixed for the first time this week, and it broke my heart. She hadn't had a haircut. She's about 5.5 years old. They went on Thursday. They got her haircut. And Valissa posted a picture of it on Facebook. And when I saw the picture, I just wanted to put my head in my hands and cry. Not seriously, but almost. Because I thought, what happened to my little girl? What happened? She's becoming, she's growing up, and I'm just like, oh my goodness. Now, here's what you need to know about Adelaide. Adelaide is soft-hearted, and I love her. She loves to make cards for people. And so she was at Journey Zone the other day. They were in the gym there playing, and they have cards and things that they can make. So she made cards, and she came to my office after the day at Journey Zone, and she said, Dad, I made a bunch of cards for this boy in my class. She said, I gave them to him, and he just threw them away. And it broke her heart. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, so it begins. But it's interesting because our girls like us to tell them stories, and so every once in a while they'll ask, and they have asked this before, Dad, how did you ask Mommy to marry you? And so I kind of tell them about that story, and so they ask, Daddy, do girls ask boys to marry them too? Oh, well, someday they're going to read the book of Ruth. And what are they going to read? They're going to read that this bold woman was willing to go out on a limb and say to Boaz, Boaz, take me under your wing. Now, a couple things should jump out to us here. Remember what he had already said in chapter 2. This is Boaz speaking. He's praying and says, may the Lord bless you, under whose wings you have come for refuge. In other words, and I love this, do you see the spunk in Ruth? That she's willing to take Boaz's words and says to Boaz, Boaz, take me under your wing. And this was a very clear image. This is something that was often cited in terms of marriage in Israel, that it was like a husband who would take a wife under his wings or would take her under his garments. It was an idea of intimacy. It was the idea of protection. It was the idea of becoming one flesh and becoming one family. And so when Ruth does this, there is no question what she is meaning. There's no question what she's implying. She's saying, Ruth is saying, Boaz, marry me. Take me. And again, listen, this isn't about romance. And I want to show you this because look at how Boaz responds. Verse 10, and remember, his response is key. He could easily just rebuke Ruth, send her away and say, never come here again. I can't believe you scandalous woman that you came here. He could easily do that and no one would have batted an eyelash. But look at Boaz's response. He says in verse 10, may the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now and before because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. In other words, Boaz is saying to Ruth, Ruth, it's a little bit strange that of all the people who live here in Bethlehem or all the people who you would potentially be eligible to marry, you chose me. And again, this isn't star-crossed lovers. This is a man who is older, moving kind of to the afternoon or evening of his days, being proposed to by this young woman. And Boaz says, may the Lord bless you for your kindness. Now, pause right here because there's something else we need to explain. It's interesting. When it says that Naomi told Ruth to put on your best clothes, there's kind of an argument as to what this word means. Because it wasn't likely that she was getting dressed up in like a prom gown to go kind of like, catch Boaz's eye. In fact, here's what many think that it means, is that Ruth, who at this point was likely wearing some kind of vestige of mourning, was told by Naomi, Ruth, take off your clothes of mourning for your husband. This visible sign of your widowhood, take those off and instead put on clothes that would have indicated to everyone, including Boaz, that I am ready to move on. In other words, as Ruth came, she didn't just look good, she didn't just smell good. Visibly, she had taken off her clothes of widowhood and said to Boaz, Boaz, I'm ready. If you will put me under your wing, I will be your wife. And Boaz, his response is, now don't be afraid, my daughter, verse 11. I will do for you whatever you say. And then look at this. Since all the people of the town know that you are a woman of noble character. Two things to point out to you about that. One, it's very interesting. In the Hebrew Bible, the order of books in the Hebrew Bible is different than in our English translations. the book that comes before Ruth in the Hebrew Bible is actually the book of Proverbs. That's important because at the end of the book of Proverbs is a chapter about a noble woman. And you know this well. There's even a ministry called Proverbs 31 Ministries. It's about the idea of what it means to be a woman of faith, a woman of God. But the important thing, and the reason why it's important, is this, is that it's the same word, it's the same description. When Boaz says of Ruth, Ruth, you are a noble woman. It's the same description. In other words, there's almost a sense that even in the order of the books, that God is saying, hey, Proverbs 31, let me show you a Proverbs 31 woman, Ruth. But I love this because not only does Boaz say, Ruth, I know that you are a woman of noble heart. I know that you are a woman of character. He says this, all of the town, everyone around has become convinced that you are this kind of woman. And when it comes to God's timing, again, we're looking at this and thinking, okay, so much has happened. There's been years, there's been months in the field. All of this has happened. But in this moment, it all culminates in Boaz's decision. And part of that decision is to look at Ruth and say, Ruth, I will do whatever you want. Why? Because I know the kind of woman that you are. And think about this. As we think about what it means to wait as the people of God, there is an endurance. There is a perseverance that can only come through waiting. Think about Ruth. What would have happened if she shows up in Bethlehem one day and God says, you know what? I love Ruth. Ruth is faithful. I'm just going to bless her immediately. What would have happened? God may have blessed her, but the people would have not accepted her. They would have continued to look at her and say, well, she's just a Moabite or she's just a foreigner. She's not one of us. It took time. It took perseverance. It took endurance for the faith that was in seed form in Ruth to grow in front of everyone. So that now, at the end of the season, everyone knew this is the woman who came and worked hard every day. This is the woman who, with no one protecting her, still came faithfully to provide for her and her mother-in-law. In other words, God knew that this was not the kind of reputation that could come about over a day or even a week. It was something that had to take place over time so that Boaz, in God's perfect timing, could not just say, I know that you're good, but everyone sees you are a woman of noble character. In other words, and I don't want you to miss this, when we think about waiting, no one likes to wait, but sometimes there are things that God wants to accomplish, and the only way that He can accomplish them is by making us wait. Boaz says, you're a woman of noble character. And he says this in verse 12, yes, it's true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. I love this because think about this. Boaz again, he's had a good meal. He's laying there on the threshing floor. He's waiting, he's sleeping. But as soon as he wakes up, I think that the text indicates here that Boaz had already thought about this. Because after all, if you wake up in the middle of the night, someone proposes to you, if you had not already thought about it, you wouldn't be able to respond like he did. How does he respond? He says, listen, thanks for the proposal, but there's someone closer. And by the way, in the legal custom, the idea was this, that the closer you were in terms of your family to the person who died, you had kind of first dibs on redeeming that person's rights. In other words, there was a closer relative than Boaz that he had to kind of work his way through. And here's the point, he knew it. He knew it when he was woken up at midnight. He had already thought about it, and yet now was the moment. The morning clothes were off. He was ready, and he was waiting. So it's true that he's closer than I, but he says in verse 13, if he doesn't redeem you, I will. So in 13 he says, stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie until the morning. Boaz again shows his faithfulness to Ruth, to Naomi, and ultimately to the Lord. He says, Ruth, I am willing, but first, there's something I need to do. I need to talk to this person who has a chance. We're going to get to him in the weeks ahead. But Boaz says, I will make sure that you're taken care of. And then the rest of the chapter is just an indication of Boaz's intention. It says in verse 14, so she lay down at his feet. She lay down at Boaz's feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Again, this was something where you didn't want to be caught at the threshing floor. You definitely didn't want to be caught as a couple at the threshing floor. Reputations were on the line. She gets up at dark, and then Boaz said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And we don't know exactly, were there other people there that Boaz was directing? We don't know, but whatever it was, we know Boaz was protecting her reputation. But then in verse 15, don't miss this. It says, and he told Ruth, bring the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. Okay, she brings her clothes, she's holding them out. And when she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town. 6 measures, the estimates are that this was somewhere around 60 pounds that she was to carry back. And here's the point. I think Boaz was saying, Ruth, I'm not just going to tell you something at the middle of the night that's just between me and you. I'm going to give you a down payment so that Ruth goes back home. And it says in verse 16, she went to her mother-in-law Naomi, who asked her, what happened, my daughter? Very interesting note here. That's actually a mistranslation. Naomi doesn't ask her what happens. The question Naomi asks is this, my daughter, who are you? And we might say, well, why did Naomi ask Ruth who she was? Naomi knew who Ruth was. Here's why. She's asking her, Ruth, who are you, in terms of what did Boaz say? We would say it like this, Ruth, are you going to have a new last name? How did it go? Who are you? What's your identity? What's your future? What happened? Who are you? And then Ruth, it says in verse 16, told her everything the man had done for her. And not only did he say it, but look at verse 17. She said, he gave me these 6 measures of barley because he said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. By the way, that's wisdom for anyone who ever is going to have a mother-in-law. Keep your mother-in-law happy. Boaz got a head start. All right? Verse 18, Naomi said, my daughter, wait until you find out how things go, for he won't rest until he resolves this today. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And in one night, all of their destinies changed. As we think about waiting, over and over again in the Bible, we see a theme. God makes his people wait. Abraham was given a promise. Through you, Abraham, all the world will be blessed. Your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky, the sand in the seashore. God gave him the promise, and what did he make Abraham do? Wait, 20 plus years. David, anointed as a young man to be king over Israel, fought in Saul's army, but what did he have to do? He had to wait. Moses, this man of God that God was raising up, spent 40 years waiting in the wilderness. God using that time in the life of Abraham, in the life of Moses, in the life of David, in the life of many more people in the scriptures who God gives amazing promises to, who God gives amazing missions to. But in the meantime, he asks them and calls them to wait. And listen, if you are in a waiting season, waiting is one of the most frustrating things, is it not? I mean, waiting on God. And we oftentimes think, God, what are you doing? Even to the point of thinking, God, have you forgotten about me? And here's the amazing thing. Think about Abraham. In the midst of that waiting, Abraham got to the point where he said, God, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should take this into my own hands. And when he got off the tracks in terms of the promises and the plans of God, that's when things began to go wrong. And here's the temptation for all of us. When God has us in this waiting period, it's tempting for us to throw up our hands. It's tempting for us to say, you know what? I'm just not going to keep going in terms of faithfulness and obedience. And whenever God calls us to wait, it's easy for us to look at that and say, God, I don't want to wait. But the Bible is so clear. When God asks us to wait, it's not because God is trying to stall us. It's not because God is trying to hold something back for us. It's because God is paving the path for us so that at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, God will come like a lightning bolt into our situation and show and reveal to us, this is what I was doing all along. Here's what it says in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 30 through 31. It says, even youths may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who trust, or other translations say it like this, those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. That there is a renewal that happens as we wait on God. Why? Because waiting produces faith. Waiting produces dependence. When you wait on God, you have to let go. You have to open your hands and say, God, when you want, where you want, however you want to do it, God, I am willing and ready to wait for you. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not grow faint. Galatians 6:9 says the same thing. It says, let us not grow tired of doing good. It's the imagery of someone working in the field, sowing and working and sowing and working and waiting for there to be a harvest. Maybe some of you are in a moment where you feel like I've sown seeds, but I don't see a harvest. Paul says it like this, let us not grow tired or grow weary of doing good, for we will reap at the proper time if we don't give up. James 1, chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Says this, brothers and sisters, consider it pure joy when you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith, that waiting period, produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect effect, full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. That oftentimes in the Christian life we find ourselves in places of waiting. I want you to think for a moment about Naomi. Naomi was in a period of waiting, and in the midst of that waiting was brokenness. She had come to the point of believing that God had turned her face against her, and yet even in the midst of that, even though the leaves of her faith were withered, the roots were deep, so that there came a point when she said, we've been waiting, but maybe God is doing something. And she was willing to come out of that bitterness and say, God, please do a new work. And even though she had been waiting for years, she had been widowed for decades, in this moment she came and said, God, will you do a new work? And here's the thing, maybe some of you are here this morning and you've got that broken heart. The hardest thing when you have a broken heart, when you have that bitter heart, is to hold on to hope. But listen, that's what Naomi did. She held on to that hope. And I want you to know, if you're here this morning and you have a broken heart, hold on to hope. Hold on to what God is doing behind the scenes. Trust in His invisible hand that He is moving, that He is weaving a story, that He has not turned His face against you. Think about Naomi. Naomi at one point believed that God had abandoned her, but in this moment she realizes, no, not only has God not abandoned me, every single moment, every single tear, every single cry He heard, He never abandoned me. He was always with me. And in this moment, like a lightning bolt, it came down and God revealed Himself to this brokenhearted woman. Listen, if you are brokenhearted, hold on to hope. God has not forgotten you. God has not abandoned you. But it wasn't just Naomi waiting, it was Ruth. And Ruth was waiting, but I love Ruth because in the midst of waiting, she was faithful. She trusted in God. Every day she got up and she kept going. She got up and she kept going. She said, God, your mercy is new every day, and I will choose to obey. And here's what I love. Because Ruth persevered in faith, God blessed her. So that Boaz could say, everyone knows, Ruth, that in your period of waiting, you were faithful. And so maybe you're here and you're wondering, God, what do you have for me? What's your will for my life? I might not have a specific answer, but here's what I know. God wants you to wake up every morning and be faithful to what He's called you to do that day. And if you will be faithful, if you will continue taking steps down that right path, God's going to take care of you. And notice, Ruth wasn't waking up looking, oh God, how are you going to deliver me? God, how are you going to protect me? She had a simple faith. And I believe that when God looked at Ruth, He loved that faith. And she persevered. But then you look at Boaz. Boaz wasn't brokenhearted. Boaz wasn't in need of provision. In fact, the indication we get is that Boaz was the kind of man who had a reputation. Boaz had money. He had wealth. He could have just ridden off into the sunset, worshiping God for the rest of his days. But here's what I love about Boaz, is that Boaz's heart was open. So that when God gave him this opportunity think about this. This wasn't something Boaz had thought about. I mean, in terms of, this wasn't something Boaz expected. And yet, because Boaz was faithful and because Boaz was willing, God did this incredible work where now Boaz is no longer one of the hundreds or thousands or millions of Israelites whose names get lost in history. No, but because Boaz was faithful, God said, Boaz, I'm going to choose you. It's about the availability of waiting. That some of you may be in a season where your heart's not broken or you're not looking for protection, but maybe you're in the sunset of your years and God is waiting, looking, longing for people to say, God, I may be about done, but I've got another act in me. I've got another step in me. God, I'm willing. I'm available. Use me how you want me. And this is what I love about Boaz, is that Boaz woke up one night and all of a sudden he wakes up the next morning and says, God did something in the middle of the night that's going to change the rest of my life. And he was willing and able to receive it. Why? Because his heart was open. And here's what I love. Whether you're brokenhearted, whether you have no idea what your future is, or whether it seems like your future is secure, we're all in periods of waiting where God, in the midst of that, wants to speak a word. He's looking for people who are faithful. He's looking for people who are willing. He's looking for brokenhearted people to redeem. He's looking for faithful people to bless. He's looking for available people to start a new mission, to start a new life, to start a new line. As we think about Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, in this single moment, all of them were waiting, but in this single moment, God changed all of their destinies at once. And as I said at the beginning, it wasn't just their destinies that he changed. And you know this, Ruth and Boaz, they're going to get married. There's this other guy, but we're going to see this in the coming weeks. This other guy's a loser. He doesn't want Ruth, and so he doesn't get her. But Boaz and Ruth, they're eventually going to get married. And Ruth has a son with Boaz. And that son has a son, their grandson. And then that son has another son. So that Ruth's great-grandchild, and this is fun to think about, isn't it? We don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. But I knew my great-grandma. She held me on her knee. Ruth's great-grandson was someone you know well. His name was David. And God, looking down the corridor of history, knew that on this night, because of the faith of a woman whose heart was broken, because of the obedience of a woman who didn't know any better, because the availability of a man who sought the heart of God, that this night at the threshing floor would lead to the birth of David. And of course, 1,000 years later, would lead to the birth of another king, who, by the way, was also born probably not far from the very place where Ruth met Boaz that night. They were all waiting, but in God's perfect timing, he began to write a new story. And I can't help but think that God loves us no less than he loves brokenhearted Naomi or faithful Ruth or available Boaz. He loves us no less. And his story for us is no less grand. But the key is this. When we face those trials, we keep our eyes on Jesus. When we sow those seeds and don't see the harvest, we can't give up. When we feel depleted of strength, when we feel like our wisdom is gone, when we feel like we have nothing left, we've got to throw ourselves the throne of God. Say, God, I'll wait as long as you want me to, because I believe your plan is better than anything I can imagine. And that's what we're going to see as we finish the story in the coming weeks. The story is glorious, but it all hinges on the obedient faith of these men and women who, like us, are imperfect. And goodness, think about Ruth and Naomi, who faced incredible odds and incredible trials. But listen, their hope was in God. And as we end today, no one likes to wait. And a pastor said this to me one time. He said, Tim, God is never late, but he's also never early. God, in his wisdom, knows exactly what to do at exactly the right time. And my prayer for you today, and my prayer for myself today, is that I will trust even while I wait. And that together we will trust even while we wait. And I believe that if we do, God's going to do something greater than we can imagine, just like he did with Ruth. Let's pray. Father, Lord, thank you for this story. Thank you for that beautiful night that some would have seen as scandalous, but Lord, you knew exactly what you were doing. You knew exactly, Lord, the timing of when to do it. And Lord, I thank you that you produced that obedience of faith in Naomi and Ruth and Boaz in a way, Lord, that you used even to save us. And Lord Jesus, even as we think about your lineage, about your heritage, Lord, I thank you for Ruth. And I thank you that we can look to her and we can look, Lord, to faithful men and women and follow in their steps as we seek after you.